Hello everyone, this is part 20 of What If Naruto was in Anbu at 6, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. We need 12 cc's of adrenaline. We need to get his heart rate back up. Damn it, Kai, stop that B flow. The voices drifted through his mind, like echoes off in the distance, barely reaching him as he struggled in and out of consciousness. White, bright light glared down on him, his eyes closing as they tried to shield his retinas from the harsh glare. There were people around him, blurred and indistinct, people he faintly recognized as those who were speaking. His body was heavy. Everything felt numb, eyes unseeing and skin unfeeling. He seemed to float in this strange place, B rising in his mouth as he coughed, feeling himself choke. He has a fibula and femoral fracture in his right leg. His foot is also completely shattered. He heard another of the voices yell out, his mind too unfocused, too confused and too tired to categorize the injuries and the danger they presented as he normally would. Images passed through his mind's eye, faces, distorted, diluted and unfocused. He couldn't understand, couldn't recognize. Dislocated shoulder, anterior cruciate ligament, as well as posterior cruciate ligament are both snapped, 6 broken ribs, 2 punctures on his left lung, as well as internal B in his stomach and a ruptured spleen. As the voice faded in his ears, growing weaker and weaker, Naruto felt something tug at his arms, removing the armored gauntlets from their place, carefully however to leave the golden bands that held his seals firmly on his wrists. Another sound reached his ears. This was something else, something small, metal maybe, falling against the floor. Naruto's head turned, his ice blue eyes opening for a moment, able to catch a brief glimpse of the butterfly pendant kept slightly beneath the armor resting on the cold floor of the tent before it was taken by one of the medics, and his eyes rolled to the back of his head, his body going lax as he finally gave into unconsciousness. Yoshino. A strangled yell was pried from Kakashi's T as one of the medics pulled out the large wooden piece of shrapnel firmly dug into his side. Kakashi didn't know why they hadn't used morphine, some complicated thing about him, possibly due to the fatigue his system was already in. Or at least that was the gist of it. Whatever the reason, it hurt a lot, and the copy ninja was not happy. A short distance away, Guy watched the proceedings with some concern, his arms crossed but his features apathetic, dark brown eyes shifting to the drapes of the tent as 2 more forms suddenly entered. Tayuya, Kidomaru. He greeted with a nod, receiving 2 in return. He continued. Naruto-sama, did you? Yay, we found him, Green Man. Tayuya sighed, running a hand through her reddish-pink hair. Her hands were shaking a little as a shuddering sigh escaped her lips, obviously troubled deeply by what she'd seen. She leaned against one of the wooden posts that held up the med tent. It's been so long. I didn't even think anything could F him up anymore. Guy frowned as Kidomaru nodded his agreement. Yay, the 6-armed shinobi continued for her. I mean, when we got there we expected, geez. I don't even know what we expected, but it sure wasn't that. He looked nearly S. As an afterthought he looked up to Kakashi, who was gripping the sides of his bed so tightly his knuckles were completely white, one of the medics at his side working frantically to remove all the remaining tiny little slivers of wood that had broken off from the main piece. You okay, Hatake? The former sound ninja questioned. Just peachy, was the gasp that escaped his lips before another pained groan escaped his lips as a shudder racked him. Kidomaru winced as he caught sight of the nasty-looking wound on his side before turning to Guy. What about that blonde-haired one, the one Kakashi brought with him? What did you do with her? Guy nodded his assent of the younger man's question. She's from Suna, obviously our prisoner. I don't know the whole details, but I put her in another of the medical wards under heavy guard. Kidomaru nodded. I see. Well, I'm going to set up a web perimeter around the camp, that way no one can sneak up on us. Tayuya, try to put a genjutsu over us as well. The last thing we need is for Kumo to attack us when we're so weak. The pink-haired Kanoiki nodded before she picked up her flute and walked out with her teammate. Guy watched them leave before he turned his eyes back to Kakashi. The copy ninja, heaving for breaths as he struggled against the blinding pain. What could have possibly happened out there? The taijutsu master questioned himself as he watched the medic work on Kakashi. They needed to move fast, back to Konoha in order to get a handle on the situation. Looking to one of the Chunin medics currently in the tent, Guy spoke in a serious tone. Give the word that we'll be breaking camp soon, once Naruto-sama is stable enough to transport. Liang and a contingent of Anbu hurriedly made their way down the side of the cliff, each trying to quickly assess and find the best route down. The stone and dirt that covered the side of the cliff could easily fall away when they stuck to it, leaving them grasping nothing but loose grains and plummeting to their deaths. The trek was dangerous, but Liang knew they had to hurry. It was imperative that they reached the rapidly fading presence they could sense at the bottom of the cliff. The Raikage looked around, watching as his Anbu tried to locate the quickest way down. They had seen the Kazekage up at the top, where he had told them of what had happened. Liang immediately ordered his men to escort the Suna leader back to Kumo, in order to give him medical treatment he obviously needed. The sleeping dragon felt a surge of impatience rise up in him. An unfamiliar sensation to the man who prided himself on near infinite amounts of said virtue and his calm demeanor in whatever situation. Glancing around, Liang saw a small stone outcropping of about 12 meters down, very small, but it seemed stable enough to withstand. So positioning himself properly, he see off the flow of chakra to his feet, allowing himself to plummet the distance, ignoring the startled cries of his subordinates as he adjusted himself mid-air. He landed perfectly on the stone outcropping, feeling it shift uneasily beneath his feet for a moment, as if it were to collapse before it settled itself. Liang took a brief moment to chide himself for taking this risk, but it soon passed as he spotted another outcropping, this one also a few meters below him. Giving another leap, the Raikage landed on it. This time, however, the stone did give way, forcing Liang to grasp at the stone with his bare hand, chakra coating it, allowing him to stick to the surface. Even so, the surface continued to break off, forcing him to rapidly continue to grasp other stones still stuck to the cliff, in effect causing him to skid down the length of the cliff as his chakra continued to latch onto different stones that quickly gave way under his weight. Beads of sweat covered his brow as he descended, trying to keep up his concentration on slowing down, or altogether stopping his descent. He was certain that if his chakra control was not as advanced as it was, he'd probably have slipped and fallen to his death moments ago. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably just a few seconds, the ground was finally in view, having fallen past the veil of mist and cloud that hung within the ravine. Molding chakra into his legs, waist, and spine to absorb the impact without shattering his bones, Liang S against the ground, falling to his knees due to the impact that he was certain would have broken every bone in his legs if he were any weaker. Even so, they were quite visibly shaky as he picked himself up, breathing deeply in order to calm himself and evenly distribute oxygen throughout his body, which would result in dulling the pain quicker, as well as getting the muscles in his legs back up to speed. But as he straightened himself fully, he caught sight of her. Small specks of blonde hair peeking out from amidst dirt and clothes torn, rocks digging into her back harshly, tiny little pebbles embedded deeply in its place. Her breathing uneven, unsteady, her eyes open yet unseeing. What had once been green grass beneath her now tainted red with her pasty pale skin belying the amount she'd lost, as he could feel the traces of the kitsune's chakra bubbling just beneath the surface. Apparently, even the great Kyubi could not single-handedly repair damage as extensive as this. He knelt down at her side, his hands ghosted over her form, as if afraid to touch her in this delicate state. His eyes took on a look of sadness as his eyes passed over her broken body again. "My dear child, what did he do to you?" His voice was barely above that of a whisper as he turned the younger girl onto her back, where he then proceeded to pick her up, cringing with something akin to pity as he heard the bones in her arms, as well as possibly her ribs, grind against one another with the slight movement, bringing a faint groan of pain from the girl's lips, even in her unconscious state. Placing one hand to gently support her head and neck as best he could, while the other went beneath her legs to pick her up bridal style, he became acutely aware of the fact that both her legs were broken given the extremely hot temperature of the areas his hands came in contact with. He wished they could get a stretcher down here, but even if they could, getting it back up with her on it would be nigh impossible. One would be waiting at the top. Ignoring the bee that was now slowly seeping through his pristine white robes, Liang lifted them both up and again had to wince at the horrible sound of her arm falling limply to her side, crunching, scraping and grinding together as it did. Amazingly, another sound followed it, as well as slight movement from the injured girl. "Akina," He called somewhat uncertainly. The younger girl's eyes fluttered, gaining focus on his face for a brief moment before she groaned again, her head falling limply onto one side, resting unsteadily on his shoulder. Sensei, please. Her whisper was so low he struggled to hear it, but as the words reached his ears, he felt a pit form in his stomach before she fell again back into the black abyss of unconsciousness. Tell me it's not true. The Konoha army in defeat, Uzumaki Naruto critically injured, the Kazekage missing. This news sent shock waves throughout the lands. As Naruto was safely transported back into the borders of Fire Country, Jiraiya's stewardship of the lands came under siege as previously conquered lands came under full assault of political and civil uprising. Dozens of small pockets of resistance sprung up in Kusa, Taki, Oto, Kiri, Konoha itself, and most especially, the recently subjugated lands of Iwa. Rumors of Naruto the Kazekage quickly spread onto Suna, where Baki, the Junin in charge of Suna during the Kazekage's absence, quickly marshaled Suna's armies, with the support of the people, as well as the former Konoha shinobi, who finally saw a chance of bringing justice onto the man who had their families. An outcry for justice spread through the land of wind, fanning the flames brought on by the spark that was the rumor of their cage. Baki himself driven even more fiercely by the personal nature of his loss. Zhuge soon capitalized on this, driving forward his men and marching them south, threatening the borders of Konoha and Iwa, as he placed large garrisons of troops in the fortresses of Sukamont and Umi, threatening both Konoha's northern border and Iwa's eastern border respectively, its navy also taking supply and trade ships along the Changjiang, which separated Kumo from the islands of Kiri. With their empire under full assault, the Demon King's empire found itself in the danger of collapse, almost as quickly as it was established. His eyes slowly opened, revealing the calm blue iris, quickly focusing on his surroundings. He lay on a soft white bed, but the calm sound of a gently flowing river reached his ears, its unfamiliarity bringing him to full alertness as he sat up on the bed, realizing that the silks that he now wore were not familiar to him either. The bed he currently sat in stood in the middle of what must have been a giant lake, as he could see nothing beyond the horizon, and the surface was too calm to be a part of the thrashing waters of the ocean. He touched his face, the familiar weight of his mask missing, the cold steel of his gauntlets, no longer present either. He looked around again and this time, managed to catch sight of a small, lonesome figure standing amidst the calm waters that glistened with the sunlight that fell over them. Tossing his legs over the edge of the bed, his bare feet came in contact with the water, finding it to be quite warm to the touch, the white silk which he was now dressed in almost blending in with his serene environment. Taking another look at the lone figure, he proceeded to make his way towards it. Slowly, ever so slowly, the figure came further and further into view as he came closer and closer to it. Its features soon becoming recognizable, until they were entirely unmistakable, even with its back to him. Just 4 feet away. Yoshino. The whisper of recognition barely left his lips before she turned to face him. Long flowing raven hair reaching her lower back, standing out in stark contrast to her bright blue eyes and silver silk dress. She looked older, somehow, since he'd last seen her, but it was unmistakable. He could never mistake her face. Those eyes, the same eyes that had looked upon him with softness, with kindness, with understanding. She looked at him then, when she fully turned. She looked at him, not at all surprised to see him. Her features were not twisted with rage or bitterness as they had been in their last encounter, but with a strange fondness, but laced with a somber undertone which rang strongly enough for him to see it with ease, even though she could never hide much from him. This is not real, he stated, raising his chin slightly as he looked down at her. She was still shorter than him. Her eyes took on another look then, one he could not recognize as her features became even more somber. She stepped towards him. Naruto did nothing, even as she came within arm's reach, even as he felt her arms wrap around his waist and embrace him, he didn't move. The slow, rumbling sounds of thunder reached his ears as he felt her head rest against his sea and the rain pelt against their bee. Strange, he should not feel in a dream. He looked down on her, his eyes meeting the top of her head as he rested one hand atop the dark crown of her hair and moved the other to wrap loosely around her shoulders, holding her amidst the rain. In the waking world, Naruto laid in his bed, fully dressed with multiple bodyguards in and around the room, all hidden from view. 3 other figures sat around the room, watching over the young leader's recovering form. One was Jiraiya, whom had been at the blonde's bedside since he arrived in Konoha nearly 1 week ago. Kakashi, who had arrived with him, still cradled his injured side tenderly so as not to tear open the chaise with any abrupt movement. And finally Hinata, whom had been called back from Iwa by Jiraiya, leaving Shino in charge of the delicate situation that was Iwagakure. He wasn't sure if Naruto would appreciate the gesture, but he truly did not know whom else he could call at this point that would care on a personal level that Naruto was injured. The Hyuga for her part still seemed somewhat shell-shocked by the entire thing. Naruto, since she met him while they were still children, had always been the most indestructible being on the face of this earth. No matter how much she had trained or learned, she always felt as if she hadn't even come close to bridging the gap of power between them. No one could, even Jiraiya always seemed like he paled in comparison to him. To see him like this, to know that he had been injured, that he could be injured at all, it was a disheartening notion. She felt as if an odd security of sorts that had been there before had been torn out from under her. When will he wake up? She questioned, looking over to Jiraiya. Watching as the Toad-Sannin shrugged. Well, the doctors say that he may, amazingly, wake up sometime today, or tomorrow. And which, considering the extent of his injuries, is a goddamn miracle as far as I'm concerned. A growl tore their attention back to the blonde as he shook his head, still asleep as he continued to thrash about a bit. It was not violent, but it was enough to worry them, which was seen as Hinata and Kakashi moved to gently, but firmly hold down his arms. Meanwhile, in the Hokage Tower several individuals sat in one of the tower's many lounges. These men being Morino Ibiki, Materashi Anko, Kaguya Kimimaro, Maito Gai and Yuhi Kurenai, whom had been called back from her position in the reserves due to the situation. Along with Tayuya, Kidomaro and Sakin having been sent away by Jiraiya to Kusa and Kiri respectively to be the temporary overseers, the hope was that their higher ranking among the populace of Konoha's military would send a stronger message than other overseers who were most of the time merely a standard Junin, along with Jirabu having been sent to Oto in order to secure their power base in the location. Outside, rain pelted against the windows, bearing down on them grey clouds, darkening the sky and casting shadows over the village. An anti-Konoha coalition seems to be taking shape around Kumo and the Reikage. Ibiki began as he gestured towards a map that was laid out on the floor before them, with him, Kurenai and Anko on one side, Tayuya and Guy on the other, Kimimaro standing by the window as he calmly observed the rain pelting against the windshield. And the Suna forces show signs of an attack on the Kisatiko garrison. He continued, gesturing another area on the map. What of the prisoner Guy? Kurenai questioned after a moment, turning to face the aforementioned man. The men at the hospital are keeping her unconscious with the use of medicine. They would like to wait for Naruto to give them the order on what to do with her, since she's apparently so important that Kakashi had to risk his life to get her here. Kurenai nodded in understanding. Before anything else could be said, Kimimaro straightened, then, turning to the others as he made his way closer to them. Regardless of the condition of our Lord, he began as he sat down. We have to do something immediately. Lady Kurenai should lead 3 squads of Anbu and head for Taki and Am, to quell the unrest that is beginning to get a grip over the area. Ibiki and I should prepare our defenses here in case of the unlikely event that Kumo should be able to march its armies this far into our territory. At the same Kimimaro, Anko interrupted with something akin to a hiss. Since when have we started taking orders from you? Kimimaro in response closed his eyes and sighed. This isn't the time for that. Impertinent bastard, aren't you? Anko questioned rhetorically, leaning back a bit. What we need right now is someone who can see us through this, or, Lady Anko, are you saying you have a better plan? The bone wielder stated, throwing a contemptuous glare in her direction. Snarling in anger, the snake mistress stood up and grabbed the bone wielder by his tee, despite the hand of one Maito Guy that held her wrist. Why, you pompous little. Enough. Another voice in, this one bringing all their attentions to the doorway. Naruto-sama. With the surprised gasps that greeted his arrival, his single, red-clad form stepping forward with ease, Hinata, Kakashi and Jiraiya at his side. He did not have his usual iron mask and hood on, for which some of them were thankful to see. But, Naruto-sama, you're not well. Guy cried out in alarm, watching as the man he would have confused for 3 days ago walk past him and sit down at the head of the map where they all gathered. Mere wounds, he grunted before he looked to Tayuya. Tayuya, send to Sakin and Kiri for aid. His voice startled her out of her momentary shock, quickly bowing to his order. Of course, was her response before she left. Wasting little time, he turned to Guy. Guy, Kurenai, take 5 Chunin squads and 6 Junin and head for Iwa, assist Aberame Shino, make sure you keep the reins of the area tight and that the Tsuchikage does not betray us. Abiki, head south and direct the defense against Suna there, Kakashi will join you once he's fully recovered. Kidomaru, Anko, attack Kumo, draw them out of Adani Castle. His orders given, the men and women assembled bowed once, each responding with a chorus. Yes sir, before they each made their way out of the room, ready to complete the orders they had been given. Once everyone but Jiraiya and Hinata left, Naruto stood up again before slowly walking towards the window. Have the recovery teams found the bee yet? You mean of Guan? Jiraiya questioned with no small amount of hesitation. At Naruto's nod he continued. Yes, he and the rest of the men that were recovered are in the morgue now. Naruto nodded. I see. He paused, his cold blue eyes never losing their frigidness, his expression never even twitching. Jiraiya, I would like you to go and begin preparations for their service. At that the older man merely nodded, running a hand through his full head of hair. Yay, sure, he muttered to himself before he walked out the door, leaving Naruto and Hinata alone in the room. There was a silence between them, as Naruto merely stared out the window and she watched his unmoving back. The silence stretched on for what seemed like an eternity until finally Naruto spoke. Hinata. Yes, Naruto-sama, she questioned as patient and calm as she could be. Tell me, Hinata, what would you do with a bird that refuses to sing? Caught completely off guard by the seemingly random question, Hinata stuttered and took a moment to regain herself. Excuse me, Naruto-sama. It's a simple question. What would you do with a bird that refuses to sing? He repeated, still staring out the window and the rain that continued to pelt the glass. The Hyuga heiress took a moment to think before she shrugged. Even little birds have their own mind and desires. If he does not want to sing now, then I would patiently wait for it to want to sing. Naruto nodded. I see. The silence once again stretched on between them before Hinata hesitantly asked. What would you do with it, Naruto-sama? He responded without hesitation. Why would I do anything else? She resisted the urge to roll her eyes at her own stupidity. She should have known. Another silence stretched on before he broke it again. Hinata, send messages to Ginchiko, Tushiro and Guan's apprentice, Mika, I believe her name was. If they so choose they may return here to Konoha for the funeral service. The Hyuga clan head bowed. As you wish, she stated, though her tone indicated her sadness at the prospect. Guan, though hardly around given his duties in Kiri, had become something of a godfather to most of the younger people of their forces, much like Jiraiya had become something akin to a grandfather and Kakashi an uncle. He was a calm, serious and distant godfather, but a godfather nonetheless. She too would mourn and miss him. Hearing the Hyuga heiress leave, Naruto continued to watch the rain, placing his bare hand against the delicate glass, the cold chill running up his hands. I will not let your death be in vain. A groan of pain reached Gaara's ears, startling him as he snapped his attention over to the form now slowly regaining consciousness on the bed. Kankuro, he said as he stood up, bringing his brother's attention towards him as he stood at the side of his bed, leaning down to stare into the puppet wielder's dazed eyes. Kankuro, for his part, only felt pain in his head, a sharp, throbbing sensation that felt as if his brain was being pressed against his skull. Gaara, he gasped before coughing. He tried to move his hand, but, to his immediate and immense horror, the appendage did not respond. Then, he took another look around. He did not recognize this hospital. Fighting down an immediate surge of panic, Kankuro swallowed the thick lump that formed in his tea, realizing that it could just be the side effect of some form of medicine, or probably hoping for it, as he hesitantly spoke. Gaara, why? He swallowed again. Where are we? Why can't I move my legs? He questioned with a pit forming at the bottom of his stomach at the pained expression that came across Gaara's face. Kankuro. The redhead took a breath through his nostrils, all but stealing himself as his face took on the grim countenance of the Kazekage. Kankuro, you've been paralyzed, from the end down. We're in Kumo's hospital. Gaara's turquoise eyes showed their sorrow openly as Kankuro's own eyes stared blankly up at the ceiling, his mouth agape as he was trying to form words that seemed caught in his tea. Why are we in Kumo? The puppet wielder eventually ventured, startling his younger brother. You don't remember. At Kankuro's minute shake of the head, Gaara looked at Kankuro with a new wariness. Kankuro, what's the last thing you remember? The puppet wielder thought for a moment, and after several moments Gaara questioned again. Kankuro, what date is it? March 13th. He answered simply, but at Gaara's horrified look he knew that was not the date. Kankuro, it's April 15th. Gaara choked out. Kankuro had only been unconscious for 3 days. Gaara. Kankuro began swallowing another lump in his tea. Tell me everything that happened. Finally, a few minutes later, Kankuro spoke, somehow managing to choke out his words through the emotions now raging within him. And Temari, what happened to Temari? He questioned as he realized his sister was not in the room. At the question, Gaara's head fell and he closed his eyes even tighter, his face scrunching up as his brows knitted. He took her. Kankuro's eyes closed as tears shined at the side of his closed eyelids, a shuddering breath escaping his lips. Gaara looked at his brother's face before he slowly reached out and grasped his hand firmly in his own. Brother, I swear I won't let him get away with this. His voice held such conviction, such a strong determination, and for a moment, Kankuro truly believed he would fulfill his promise. At the sight of Gaara's reassuring hand grasping his own, he allowed the tears he had been trying to hold back fall down the sides of his face. He couldn't even feel his brother's fingers. In another room, Zhuge Liang stood above Akina's slowly rousing form, the impeccable white robes blending in seamlessly with the surrounding white walls. His raven black hair in stark contrast to everything around him. He watched her eyes slowly flutter open, shifting left and right in order to look around the room before they finally landed on him, the dazed, lost look in her eyes causing him to stiffen somewhat. Sensei. Her voice was hoarse as tears slowly began flowing down her cheeks, sorrow bordering on the edges of despair lining her features. Yes, he questioned. He knew what she was going to ask, but he had to make sure. Sensei. She paused. Please tell me that he was lying, Sensei. Her face twisted in pain, but not from her injuries as she stared at his impassive face. Please tell me he's not my brother. Liang closed his eyes with a sharp intake of breath. He had been hoping against it, but hope was a fool's game. He looked into her eyes for a brief moment before looking away. He could lie to her, tell her that he was indeed lying. But he wouldn't. For one thing, it would only dig him in deeper, because despite her words she would not just drop this here if he says so, she would look again and she would discover him. But also, some part of him admitted that he did owe her this much. He was willing to withhold information from her, but he was not willing to lie to her. That was a line even he was not willing to so callously cross. He sighed as he shook his head. I'm afraid that it is no lie, my dear. He was telling you the truth. He watched her reaction carefully as her breath hitched, her eyes gaining such a deep look of betrayal and utter hurt that it made his own heart twist with something akin to guilt at the sight. Yo, how long have you known? She questioned as she looked away from him, her eyes sweeping over the bed sheets as she asked the question, swallowing the lump in her tea as she did. Since before you arrived in Kumo, he answered truthfully, never making any other movements, though to the trained eye, it was clear he was ready for the reaction he knew would come as she saw her grip the bed sheets tightly. 9 years, she questioned in something akin to horror, red beginning to seep into the white sheet firmly in her grip as her nails punctured her skin, her knuckles turning white as she shook. You knew that he was my brother. For 9 years. Yes, he answered with another nod, already feeling the red yuki of Kyubi's chakra rising up to the surface, bubbling beneath her skin as it shimmered around her. You trained me. You were going to use me to kill him. This time it wasn't a question, and the new feeling of anger was beginning to overshadow her betrayal, as could be seen by the red chakra which was now uncontrollably rising from her. Yes, he answered anyway. Would you ever have told me, Liang? He took note of the use of his name. She never called him by name. Always Sensei, still he should expect no different. No. A simple answer to a simple question. Her eyes snapped up to his then, the animal red brimming with tears that freely streamed down her face, the sorrow and pain of her features a stark contrast to the deep white hot rage that burned deeply in her eyes that showed an equally great amount of rage and pain. Before he knew what was happening, she had lunged from the bed, claws extended with a cry as she swiped at him. Acting quickly, he leaned away from the attack, her arm continuing until it struck the wall. Stone and concrete giving way under the force of the blow, revealing the remains of the city through the opening before she spun around towards him, her speed momentarily surprising him as she delivered a harsh, sharp kick that connected solidly with his C, sending the rake's into the weak wall of dried plaster. The startled cry of nurses breached the thin barriers as fine cracks appeared on the other side. Before she was able to come at him again, the Anbu were there, swiftly holding her down as she struggled against them. Sobs tore themselves from her tea as she screamed and struggled, glaring deeply into the sleeping dragon's eyes, allowing him to see the pain, the hurt, the anger, but most of all, the question of why, shining deep within her eyes. How could you? He heard her scream amidst her struggles. How could you, you bastard? She howled and thrashed, nearly hurling her captors right off. I trusted you. Her struggles were intense even as the wounds previously inflicted on her reopened themselves, seeping through her bandages. Liang watched her with seeming indifference. But one could tell he was slightly worried about her, for whatever reason that may be. Finally her struggles began to rest down, her breathing becoming labored as she coughed up tears still flowing freely down her face and dripping onto the floor. Falling to her knees as she continued to cry, still held in Gaara's sand. How could you? She asked one final time, falling from her lips and onto the cold hospital floor before she finally gave into the darkness that crept along the edges of her vision. The medics came soon after carrying a stretcher. Rain pelted against them as they stood, looking at the closed caskets as they lay before them. Flowers lay strewn generously across the courtyard, the sobs and cries of the assembled crowd of hundreds creating a grim, somber orchestra. The gathered shinobi allowed the civilian members of the fallen shinobi's families to stand freely in the street as they took to the nearby roof and tree tops. Their black shinobi wear, reflecting that of the gathered crowds. The dark cotton seemed to absorb the light around it, coalescing their entire forms in shadow. Naruto stood on a podium, overlooking the assembled mass of people. He was dressed in formal cage robes, only these were entirely black, the straw hat with the kanji for fire on his head standing out from the dark background due to the red ink they were written in. We stand here today. He began, his voice unwavering and cold as the rain that showered them. To honor our comrades fallen in battle. He allowed his eyes to pass over the assembled crowd, taking in the looks now directed at him, filled with grief, pain, and more than a few with resentment. They blamed him. He lifted his chin and continued. These men and women were great and powerful warriors, each in their own right. They were each important, each an essential stone in our structure. He stepped off the podium, walking down and passing between the assembled rows of caskets. Finally he rested his hand on one of them, manipulating his facial muscles to take on a somber expression, an emotion that never reached his eyes. They are lost to us now though, taken from us. He turned his eyes from the casket to the crowd and continued high speech. Nearby, Jiraiya watched the proceedings with narrowed eyes, holding no small amount of distaste for what he was seeing. He wasn't ignorant, and with each word that spilled from Naruto's lips he felt his stomach twist tighter and tighter. He was playing them, toying with them. Naruto had written this speech himself, it was meant to use the grief, manipulate it, and twist it for his own ends. He was using his words as a means to get his claws into their minds and reaffirm them into his control. Jiraiya knew this was necessary, he knew that they needed to keep the populace belief in them. To keep their leash nice and short, otherwise their foundation would crumble beneath their feet and their empire would collapse around their ears, but he still couldn't help but feel utterly disgusted. He knew that being a ninja was far from the romanticized idolatry they used to convince parents to let their kids become genin in the first place. He knew that many times they would be called to do things some might consider evil, things that were harsh, cruel, even monstrous. But to use people's grief over the loss of their loved ones as such, to manipulate and control them this way. Jiraiya couldn't help but wonder what kind of leader would be so callous. My people, he said, his voice piercing through Jiraiya's haze-filled mind, allowing a tinge of what Jiraiya could only call sadness to creep into his voice. I know that no matter what I say here today, nothing can bring these people, your loved ones, back to you. He paused. Again he allowed his eyes to pass over the crowd. There were no longer faces of resentment, only of deep sadness. But I feel your loss as well. He continued, placing his hand on one of the younger civilian boy's shoulder, possibly the son, or the younger brother of one of the fallen. Each of these brave men and women, they were my soldiers, my comrades, my brothers and sisters. He walked through the crowds, watching as they parted for him. And each one of them, he continued, raising his voice so it could be heard surely and clearly over the crowd. I would feel the pain of their passing. The loss of each one of these brave men and women who gave up their lives for me. He paused again as if contemplating his next words. No, not just for me, but for a vision. An ideal. A dream, that their families may be able to sleep in their beds without fear, that their families no longer need to worry if one of their own will not return from his mission this time. That wives will not be widowed, that children will not be orphaned, that this pain that we experience now, the pain of loss, the pain that another of our loved ones will no longer be with us will not be experienced due to these wars, these silent battles that take place every day. He took a breath. This was their dream, he said, a dream of peace. As he finished, his voice seemed to grow yet somehow remain the same in volume. His brows knitted together in anger then. But some defy that dream. Some would see the chaos continue, to never allow the rivers of be shed from men and women as brave and proud as these that lay before you today to stop flowing. He snapped his eyes up to sweep over the faces of the civilians around him. Once again the grim faces slowly filled with anger, but this time, those looks were not directed at him, but toward the situation these people currently found themselves in. They wanted revenge and he would be their conduit for it. My people, he continued, his voice gaining that familiar edge of danger Jiraiya and some of the shinobi that had previously worked with him could recognize. I know that you wish to mourn your lost loved ones. Many would call a shinobi who shows his sorrow to be weak. But they forget that a person is only weakened by their sorrow as much as they allow themselves to be. I look upon your faces now, and I do not see weakness. I see strength. I see power. I see a desire for vengeance. At his last words he saw their faces twist in bitterness and anger, tears shining in eyes that smoldered with anger, and Naruto had to stop himself from smiling in satisfaction. Citizens of Konoha, I ask you now, after this loss, after this defeat, will you turn your backs on these, our fallen? Will you allow yourselves to be dissuaded by the bee now staining our enemies' blades? Will you cower in fear and allow the dream of these men and women, your families, to crumble? The dream they each gave their lives to preserve. Murmurs came from the gathered, mutterings here and there. Or will you stand with me now? As one people. A people who refuse to allow the dream of peace that has been bled for by those they love to wither and crumble to ash. He paused, taking a few steps through the parted crowds. If this is so, then shout. Confused whispers see through the crowd. Naruto paid it no heed as he looked down at the same boy he had touched earlier. You. He nodded, shout. The youth paused, looking nervous before he swallowed and offered out a weak cry. Louder, he demanded. They cannot hear you. He gestured towards the row of caskets. Shout so they can hear you. So that they will know the dream has not yet s. The boy shouted louder, joined by a few others. Not enough. Louder, he demanded, using a few of the shadow clones he had spaced within the crowd to spur others on. More and more soon joined. Will you let them end like this? This time the sound was a wall, into his sea with invigorating force as the men and women were swept up in the frenzy. They still can't hear you, brothers. The sound could be heard across the village. Suna tiredly rubbed the bridge of her nose as she leaned back in her office chair. Kazekage-sama, I just don't know. The red-headed Kage of Suna sighed as he ran a hand through his hair. Sunad-san, your skills as a medic are legendary even in Suna. Are you absolutely certain nothing can be done? Sunad sighed, leaning forward in her chair and resting her elbows on her desk as she laced her fingers in front of her mouth. Kazekage-sama, I don't think you fully appreciate the full weight of this situation. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a chart of the human and its bone structure. Specifically, the spinal column. Your brother has 3 out of 4 lumbar vertebrae completely shattered and 2 of his upper thoracic vertebrae cracked, the bone fragments of which are pressed against clusters of nerves located within the spinal column, which is what's paralyzed him. Even if I were to remove these bone fragments from these nerve clusters without him, the most Kankuro-san can hope for is the reuse of his arms. He'll never re-establish the use of his legs. Even if he were to have a completely successful procedure, his career as a ninja is over. There's no way around that. She paused, giving the Kazekage a pitying glance as her eyes softened. Kazekage-sama. This isn't a matter to be taken lightly. The chances of surviving this procedure alone are at 60%, and the chances of its success are even slimmer. You could lose your brother altogether on that table. Gaara closed his eyes, pain visible easily in his expression as his features tightened. What Kankuro has right now isn't a life, it's an existence. Please. He chopped through his words. I would like you to proceed with the operation, and so would he. Tsunde's eyes softened at his plight. All right, Kazekage Dono. As you wish. Gaara nodded his thanks, but before he could voice them, the door opened, revealing Liang. Ah, Kazekage Dono. He greeted with a bow, Gaara returning it as he stood up from his chair. Noticing the somber atmosphere of the room, Liang spoke up again. If this is a bad time, I can return later. No, Gaara said with a shake of his head. We're done here for the moment, I believe. If you need me, I will be in my brother's room. Of course, Kazekage Dono. Liang replied with a bow. If there's anything you need, please do not hesitate to ask. Gaara nodded. Thank you for your hospitality. He bowed again before he turned to leave. Ah, Kazekage Dono. Liang called to him before he could leave. If you feel up to it, later on today, can you meet me in my office? I believe it is time we discuss our next move, against Konoha. Gaara's gaze darkened before he nodded grimly. Of course. Before he walked out the door, closing it behind him, leaving the sleeping dragon and the slug princess alone. After the door was closed, Liang turned to Tsunde. How is Ying? Tsunde nodded. Both her legs suffered several fractures. But with some physical therapy she should be back on her feet in about a month, and back on the active shinobi roster in 2 months. She'll be under for the next 2 days in order to keep her from the pain, which would probably be unbearable if she were conscious. After that you can visit her. Liang nodded. Thank you, Tsunde. Tsunde took a deep breath as she stared at him in the eye. Don't patronize me, Zhuge Liang. I know that's not all you came here for. Liang sighed slightly before he sat down in one of the chairs. Akina. He paused, minding his words within these listening walls. Is no longer ignorant of her origins. Tsunde's breath hitched, her eyes widening as she seemed to collapse in her chair, releasing a deep regretful sigh. I see. She looked back into his eyes. Her own eyes sorrowful and for once, fully showing her age. Liang could see that the decision to keep Akina's true origins from her were a decision that had always weighed heavily on her conscience. But, unlike him, when she had decided to keep the truth from Akina, it was purely on the belief that it was for the girl's benefit. The severity of that information could do many things to anyone's psyche. Tsunde had kept the information because she wanted to protect the younger girl. Whereas he had kept it, because he needed her in order to defeat her brother. And if she knew he was her brother, she would more than likely hesitate. He would not. He had demonstrated that quite clearly, judging from the condition he had left her in at the bottom of that gorge. Tsunde finally sighed again. Why are you telling me? Liang stood from his chair and approached the window slightly behind her. I am prepared to tell Akina that I alone knew the information of her past, and that it was my sole decision to keep it from her. Rendering you blameless. I'm just here to tell you so you don't say something you shouldn't later. No. The legendary medic's voice brought his attention back to her. No. He questioned. No. She repeated firmly. I decided to keep the information from her, and I'm going to accept the consequences of those actions, whatever they may be. Liang looked at her for a moment before nodding. I see. Admirable of you, I suppose. Because of her current instability, she's being held at Anbu Facility 231. I request, however, that you make your confession as soon as possible. I believe it is best to tell her all at once and then ride out the storm, instead of waiting. I think you're right. She agreed solemnly. When should we go? She questioned after a brief moment of silence. Later tonight. I still have several duties that need to be completed throughout the village, not to mention reconstruction. And I imagine you yourself have some duties to complete here in the hospital. Tsunde nodded. Liang returned it before leaving the room. Leaving the slug princess in her office, where she quickly drank a small cup of sake, she would be needing more of that soon. Meanwhile, in a base hidden somewhere on the Shinobi continent, the 7S class missing ninja which now formed the group of ninja known as Akatsuki gathered. This world is getting interesting again. Kisame spoke with his sharp-toothed smile. This war could be bigger than even the last great shinobi war of Konoha and Iwa. Indeed. Sasori of the Red Sands spoke, his lumbering hunched form appearing quite short amongst his peers. This is developing into a war like no other before it. A world war, if you will. It will be interesting to see how it develops. Enough, both of you. The chilling voice of Painel right through the darkness of the cavern, silencing both of his subordinates with ease. This war will only make our jobs more difficult. There are only 3 Jinchuriki we are currently missing. The Kyuubi, the Nibi and the Ichibi. All 3 of these Jinchuriki have become exceedingly powerful and will be carefully guarded by their respective village. The Ichibi is the Kazekage of Suna, the Nibi is a high-ranking Kunoiki Junin in Kumo, and the Kyuubi is the man that has taken control of half the world by sheer might. Itachi finished for him. Pain nodded before he looked to Zetsu and Konan. Zetsu, Konan, you two are our top intelligence operatives. Outline the best strategy to defeat these 3. Konan nodded before looking to Zetsu. Should you go first or should I? You. The fly-trap-looking shinobi answered. The Kunoiki nodded before she cleared her tea. The Ichibi Jinchuriki can control and manipulate sand. He is praised for his nearly impenetrable defenses. His ability to control sand would make him nearly impossible to defeat on his home turf of Suna. I've learned that his defenses can be somewhat overcome with the use of sheer speed. In fact, this seems the only truly practical method to achieve this. Another method would be to wet his sand. It would make it slower, allowing for an easier time of defeating his defenses. But, in retrospect, making his sands wet also make them heavier, therefore more difficult to break through with sheer force and more powerful when used in offensive abilities, not to mention much more binding than his normal sand, meaning if he ensnares you in it with his sand wet you'll have a much tougher time of getting out. I would recommend Kisame and Deodara as the best ones to fight against this Jinchuriki. Pain nodded. And the Nibi? Ah, yes, the Nibi is quite different from the Ichibi. The blue-haired Kunoiki spoke up, clearing her tea a bit before she continued. This Jinchuriki we consider to be the weakest of the remaining Jinchuriki. But she is still quite formidable, proven to us by the deaths of Hiden and Kakazu. We believed those 2 would have been enough to defeat her, but apparently we were wrong. Her attacks entail of the use of purple flames, more ethereal than and not as powerful as something like Itachi-san's Amaterasu, but this acts as a defense and offensive technique simultaneously, shrouding her entire body in it even as she launches several columns of flames at her opponents. This makes taijutsu nearly S against her. Water does not douse the flames and it is not affected by wind either. The best strategy would have been hidden see her before she transformed, but apparently he failed to accomplish that. Recommended abilities are high-level earth techniques, explosions or possibly strong poisons to incapacitate her before she has a chance to transform. For this reason I would recommend either Deodara-san, or Sasori to fight her. Pain and the others nodded before rounding on Zetsu. Zetsu. Pain acknowledged with a nod. You are our best infiltrator. What have you discovered? Zetsu closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The Konoha Jinchuriki, sir, to put simply, is beyond the abilities of anything short of a 3-man team consisting of Itachi, Kisame and Sasori to defeat him. You believe he is that strong? Pain questioned skeptically. He did manage to defeat Itachi and Kisame when he was still just a boy. Sasori commented. With 10 years more experience, many things are possible. The boy is in the prime of his life right now. Pain looked to Zetsu, silently telling him to continue. To be honest, sir, I have only managed to see the Kyuubi Jinchuriki fight once. During his besieging of the city of Sakai, he single-handedly killed nearly 100 Iwa ninja, through the use of wind techniques, fire techniques and the summoning of almost 50 serpents. After which he faced the cage of Iwa and several of Junin-level guards that were possibly from Suna and former refugees of Konoha. He defeated them all without receiving a single debilitating injury. How much of the Kyuubi's chakra did he call on? Pain questioned. I sensed none of the Bijuu's chakra. Zetsu replied, simply watching as some of the others tried to hide their surprise with little success. Only Pain seemed unperturbed by this news. I see. The leader of the Akatsuki spoke. We will have to be very careful then. The villagers are on high alert now, and entering them at this point would be foolish. Therefore we will have to bide our time. We cannot afford to lose any of you on field missions. I have studied the seals reportedly used by the Yondaime to seal the fox demon, and judging by the design, it will easily take all 7 of us to safely extract the Kyuubi. He allowed his eyes to pass over his subordinates. Return to your previous tasks. I will summon you when the time is right. Zetsu, find Hidden and Kakazu's rings and return them to me. No words were spoken as 5 of the 7 ninjas slowly faded back into shadow, leaving the wielder of the Rinnegan and his long-time teammate alone. Temari's first sensation at returning to the living world was one of an almost overwhelming urge to vomit. Little known to her, this sensation was a side effect of the meds the nurses and doctors had used to keep her sedated while Naruto had been unconscious. Also, because she had been receiving nutrients, minerals and such through an IV tube in order for her body to continue functioning and not essentially starve to death. Her stomach was empty, meaning that all she was able to conjure up were dry heaves as she coughed and choked on her saliva, leaning off to one side of the bed, a small string of drool managing to escape her lips, descending to the white-tiled floor before it was intercepted with a paper bag firmly gripped by a single, uncovered hand. Clad in formal-looking black robes that were as dark as midnight, the sheen of light reflected from the delicate silks gave way how expensive they were. But she scarcely registered this in her mind before she chose to continue heaving and coughing as if she was trying to rid herself of her lungs. I would appreciate it if you would not release the contents of your stomach over my floors. The voice of the individual standing above her sent cold chills down her spine and made her stomach drop. It was like ice picks lined along her back. Tiny little pin pricks sending her nerves into overdrive and her heart to racing in dread. She swallowed thickly, literally willing her stomach to settle before she looked up, her grayish-silver eyes clouded with trepidation as they met with the biting steel blue that stared straight back unflinchingly. Before she could contemplate this stranger in front of her, her mind was suddenly flooded with memories of the events that had taken place when she was last conscious. The battle, how she and Kankuro had rushed into the fight when it looked as if the Konoha Jinchuriki was about to strike the younger brother down. Even though they knew it was neither one of them could simply sit by and watch that happen. So they had fought, and she had seen her brother's favorite puppet, Karasu, torn to pieces and had shortly after bared witness to the horrifying sound of her brother's back being broken in two when the red-clad devil had kicked him with the force of a freight train. Oh my god, Kankuro, she said, shooting up to a sitting position, only to grip her stomach in pain as the wounds previously inflicted on her reopened themselves with the swift movement, red beginning to sift through the fabric of the bandages tightly wound around her abdomen. A thin sheen of sweat now decorated her brow as she let out a hiss of pain. She was breathing through her teeth, her sea heaving as the chilling voice of her observer once again reached her ears. Do not move. You are too valuable to be out before you have fulfilled your purpose. What a yo, she began but froze as she finally caught sight of the outside world through her window. Her eyes met with a thick, lush vegetation of forest. But not just any forest, she recognized this forest, these trees. She recognized their species and knew that they grew only in Konoha, the forest supposedly grown by the Shodai Hokage. It was unique vegetation which for whatever reason only grew here in the Leaf Village. Her heart seemed to tighten, the pupil of her eye shrinking slightly as a terrible realization settled over her, chilling her skin, digging into her bones as they seemed to freeze the bee in her veins. Her breaths began to come in short, quick pants as she started to hyperventilate. She slowly turned back to her intimidating companion, her eyes taking him in this time, and more importantly, the clothing he wore. She recognized the robes. Gaara had needed to wear such clothing for funeral events during the deaths of some of the councilmen. There were obviously some differences, but the design remained the same, and in order to verify, she looked to his wrist, a single seal, the seal of the cage of Konoha engraved into the material in red lining. She had not seen it before due to the bag he had been holding. Her fear increased tenfold as she looked into his eyes again. This time, his fair image faded away, replaced with the more familiar, more terrifying image of the red-robed Devil King of Konoha. The man she had come to fear in her career as a ninja, and as she looked deep into his sea blue eyes she could just imagine them shift to red. But despite the disparity of him in and out of his armor, she could still see it, the cold, hard, uncaring eyes of the man that had thousands. He nodded. I see that you are now fully aware of the situation you find yourself in, Konoiki of Suna. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.